El Cybersecurity Nation Leaders Forum ha sido posible gracias al gentil patrocinio de Secnesis, de Cybersecurity Company y Código Verde, consultores de seguridad de la información. ¿Cómo saber cuál es la brecha entre el conocimiento de un profesional de TI en seguridad y lo que sus roles y funciones requieren? La detección de necesidades de capacitación de seguridad de la información, o DNCSI, te muestra la ruta de capacitación personalizada que maximiza tu efectividad al realizar tus funciones con seguridad. Visita nuestro sitio web, llena el formulario y recibe tu reporte personalizado gratis.
¿Deseas complementar tus conocimientos de seguridad de la información?
¿O iniciar tu formación en esta disciplina?
En ambos casos, el CITI te ofrece el panorama más completo en un solo entrenamiento.
El CITI aborda más de 40 temas. Combina sesiones en vivo con ejercicios y prácticas, así como lecciones en video.
Al finalizar, conocerás el compendio más amplio de prácticas generalmente aceptadas.
Los profesionales de tecnologías de la información que ahora son llamados a mantener y mejorar la seguridad de su organización
encuentran en el CITI la referencia más confiable.
Ya saben hacer su trabajo. El CITI los faculta para hacerlo con seguridad.
Inscríbete y serás un profesional CITI acreditado por el Consejo CITI.
El Consejo CIE es una organización de voluntarios de alcance internacional y actualmente estamos convocando a quienes integrarán los comités durante el 2022. ¿Te interesaría incorporarte a nuestra organización? Para facilitar tu ingreso, hemos diseñado un proceso que inicia visitando nuestro sitio web. Puedes colaborar desde tu país en cualquiera de los siguientes comités y foros: Comité Técnico, Comité de Vinculación, Comité de Relaciones con la Industria, Comité para CIOs y CISOs, Comité de Mujeres en Seguridad, Comité del Cybersecurity Nation 2022 y Foro para el Sector Público. Te invitamos a registrarte ahora mismo e iniciar tu trayectoria en el Consejo. Esperamos pronto darte la bienvenida. El Cybersecurity Nation Leaders Forum ha sido posible gracias al gentil patrocinio de Secnesis, de Cybersecurity Company y Código Verde, consultores de seguridad de la información. Bienvenidos al Cybersecurity Nation Leaders Forum, el evento que presenta a los actores de talla internacional que contribuyen significativamente a la seguridad de la información y ciberseguridad. La conferencia de esta mañana, titulada De los ataques a la acción, creando un programa de ciberseguridad eficaz, por Tony Sager, vicepresidente senior y evangelista en jefe en CIS, The Center for Internet Security Inc. Presento al ponente. Lidera el desarrollo de CIS Controls, un proyecto de consenso mundial para encontrar y respaldar las mejores prácticas técnicas en ciberseguridad. Es un defensor entusiasta del uso de syscontrols y otras soluciones obtenidas de ciberataques anteriores para mejorar la ciberdefensa global. También nutre a la comunidad mundial independiente de voluntarios de SIS, alentándolos a hacer de su empresa y del mundo conectado un lugar más seguro. En noviembre del 2018, agregó el desarrollo de estrategias y la divulgación para SIS a sus responsabilidades. Además de sus deberes para SIS, es un voluntario activo en numerosas actividades de servicio comunitario, la Junta Directiva de la Red de Apoyo al Ciberdelito y miembro del Foro de Resiliencia Cibernética de la Academia Nacional de Ciencias, asesor para varias escuelas y universidades locales y servicio en numerosos grupos de estudio y paneles asesores a nivel nacional. Sin más preámbulo, bienvenidos al evento.
Well, hello, and my name is Tony Sager with the Center for Internet Security, and thank you very much for your time and attention today. It's my pleasure to come talk to you a little bit about cybersecurity. I'm at 45 years now and counting in this business, so I've seen a lot of good things and a lot of things that weren't so good, and my goal is to help share some of the lessons learned over a long lifetime and career in thinking about how do we deal with these complicated cyber problems. So let me bring up the presentation, and we can go through this quickly. So let me explain the title a little bit first, From Attacks to Action. So I've spent a lifetime studying the way attacks work, both at the local level and at the nation-state level. And that's what we have to work with, right? That is the data that allows us to understand the nature, the technical nature of attacks and the kinds of things that attackers do. And the goal is to learn from that so that we can build an effective cybersecurity program, both for individual enterprises, but also for large communities of enterprises. So I'll talk about the way all that comes together, the way we learn from attacks and translate them into action. So you may see my job title. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Evangelist for the Center for Internet Security. We're a small nonprofit company headquartered in the United States, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we do. I got that title of Chief Evangelist. It's a bit of a story, but it's partly because I've been doing this so long and have seen so many things. So the way I learn and the way I teach is about telling stories about what we've seen in the business. So if you, in this business of cybersecurity, all the technology and the acronyms and the fancy language, if you are overwhelmed and confused by it all, well, welcome to the club. It is complicated. And some of it is complicated naturally because of all the technology and all the issues and all the changes. And some of it, I think, we make more complicated than it needs to be. But normally we're drowning in all these special phrases and complex language. And some number of years ago, I coined a phrase I called the fog of more. So having watched this for so many years, what I realized some years ago was that it wasn't that we lacked good defensive practices or training or tools or good people. It's that we were overwhelmed. We had more. That is, we didn't know how to choose the most effective things to do. So instead of being empowered by all the new tools for defense and the new training and the new processes, we were overwhelmed by them. And the marketplace is inherently noisy and complicated, right? Lots of people making claims. Every consultant will have a different answer for you. Every tool vendor will have a solution. And your challenge is, how do I sort through all that, make sense of it, and make good choices in how to defend myself? That's really our challenge here. And that's really the work of the Center for Internet Security. Is we try to do that in a way that helps people make good choices without having to spend decades and all this energy trying to just understand the problem. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we do at the center. We have roughly two major lines of business. One is called security best practices. And this is how the company was founded a little over 20 years ago. We produce three mainline products. One is called CIS benchmarks. And for those that work in the technical aspects of this business, think of it this way. What's the most effective way for me to configure a piece of information technology for best security? And that piece of technology could be a desktop, it could be a router, it could be a mail server, it could be a perimeter device. And around the year 2000, 2002, and 2003, there was a growing sense that we needed to configure systems better in order to both prevent attacks, but also bound them to make them to prevent them from spreading further. So the company was founded on the idea of benchmarks about 20-something years ago. It turned out, I've been around the company since it was founded, but I was working in the US government at the time at the National Security Agency, creating essentially what we now call CIS benchmarks. And I was doing that for the Defense Department and for the US government. Well, a small nonprofit company called the Center for Internet Security stood up to do the same thing in the private sector. And they would examine a piece of technology, for example, a Windows desktop, and figure out, there were at that time maybe many hundreds of configuration settings that could possibly affect security. So how do I make good choices all the way down there? And the center was created to bring together expert volunteers to kind of argue their way through that and decide what that should be and create what was called a benchmark. Well, that line of business continues to this day and has been very successful, and we are the world's largest producer of such things, non-government producer of such things. As we've all moved to the cloud, so must our benchmarks. And so we produce a thing now we call CIS hardened images. And that is essentially the same content as the benchmark, but now through a cloud image that's through one of the commercial cloud providers. So if you go to Amazon Web Services or Google or Microsoft, any of the major providers, you can say, I want 100 desktops and I want them pre-configured to the benchmark for the Center for Internet Security, and you can do that directly through them. You don't even have to come through us. So we have been moving the benchmark guidance, sort of where the technology goes, into the cloud. We also produce something called the CIS controls. Some of you may know them as the critical security controls. And I'll talk a little bit about where that comes from in just a moment. So we have all these best practices. That is, we use volunteers to create these guidance documents, these practices, and we publish and give them away at no charge to the public. And we fund the company through a membership model. The second big line of business for us is operations and security services. So we are in this business 24/7, running a watch center, and we're doing that on behalf of the US government for state, local, tribal, territorial governments. So in the US, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, we say the acronym ISAC, is a formal legal construct. And so there are one of those for each of what are identified as critical infrastructures in the US. We happen to operate two of them under sponsorship of the US government. So that term multi-state Information Sharing and Analysis Center, we operate that. That's the gathering of state, local, and tribal and territorial governments. And I think we're at 13,000 to 14,000 member governments now, ranging from big states like New York and California to county governments to city governments and everything in between. And it's a place where people report the kinds of problems that they're seeing. They look for guidance and bulletins and advisories from us. And we pull all that together to do the analysis, to look at trends, look at summaries, and share that across state, local, tribal, and territorial governments in the US. And then for the last 3 years, we have operated a similar activity, but for election infrastructure. So for all the machinery that goes into conducting, managing, and reporting on elections, we do the same kind of work. And you can imagine how lively that's been for the last few years. And then we deliver all that through a sales and business organization. But the bottom line of what we do, especially in best practices, is we create them, give them away in some sort of form, and we fund the nonprofit through a services kind of model. That is, you can become a member and you get services and tools and some other things. But the primary content is always available at no charge. This is just a quick snapshot of all the different CIS benchmarks. As I mentioned, we're the world's largest independent producer of such things. There's well over 100 of these spread across many vendors, many different families of technologies. Every month we're adding more and updating old ones. These are a bedrock core principle of any security program. If you are creating your own, you're probably wasting time. You ought to just take ours and start from that. And again, you can get it at no charge from us. But if you're going to try to come up with a corporate level or an enterprise level configuration for your desktops and your servers, you can start from what we've already done, or you could participate directly. As I mentioned, these are created by volunteers. So we bring people together and you can be among those people. And we sort of run it as a social media operation where experts exchange opinions, and from there we create the actual content, which is distributed, either directly from us or indirectly through, as I mentioned before, cloud service providers. But this is always changing. In the notes, I'll give you some references to how to see what we've done currently. I also mentioned the CIS controls, or the critical security controls. This is a project that I was involved with when I was still in government in about 2007 or 8. And as I mentioned, I've been doing this a long time, and my business has always been about security testing for defense. So everything from looking at the mathematics of cryptography to examining software to look for 0 days and find those kinds of bugs and problems, to field testing and everything along that line of things. And what I realized after, so I started as a technical practitioner, moved into management, and once I got to see a lot of these things across many jobs, across many different skills that we would apply to find those problems, the real awakening for me was in the early 2000s, when I realized all we were doing was finding the same problems over and over again. And it wasn't because people were lazy or they didn't care. It's because these are messy problems, right? They're operationally hard. They're not theoretically hard, but managing a complicated computing enterprise that spans lots of different, for example, geographies or different types of data is just a messy business, and things change all the time. And so we were finding over and over again the same problems. So as I looked at that, I said, the problem, and it's back to that, the fog of war, the problem was that people were overwhelmed and we needed to help them get started. So I gathered some of the smartest folks that I knew at the time and said, what we need to do is stop trying to give people really big control lists or recommendations or catalogs and get them started on what's the smallest number of things that they need to do to get going. What are your first steps? Where do you get your most value with the initial things that you do? And that started as a 2-page letter as an NSA Defense Department project in about 2008. And it went through this evolution here, where the 2-page letter was found by a think tank in the DC area, and then a commercial company, the SANS Institute, which is the biggest teacher of cybersecurity in the world. And they turned it into what was popularly known as the SANS Top 20. Which is, again, rather than try to overwhelm people with pages and thousands of pages of recommendations and data, the goal was to focus in on a small number of things that everyone should do to get started. We formalized that over the years, and when I retired in the 2012, I wound up taking the project back over from SANS and then spinning it out into a nonprofit company, which is now part of the Center for Internet Security. But the idea has always been the same. Don't overwhelm people with advice or guidance or recommendations, but help them focus on the most important things to do based upon what bad guys are doing to us. The bad news is we get attacked every day. The good news is we're actually learning, right? We have the opportunity to learn from these attacks about the tradecraft, about the techniques and tools that attackers use, and therefore, how do we turn that into action? So that's the basic idea of it. So the core of what I wanted to talk to you about today was what I call the defender's dilemma. And this is a bit abstract, so bear with me. And it consists of 3 parts. Most of us focus on, what do I need to do? What's the right thing to do to defend myself in cyberspace? And how much of it do I need to do, right? And this is complicated because attackers are changing all the time and tools are changing, and the technology is changing. The way your business uses technology is changing. So it's a very complex, dynamic problem. And none of us has perfect knowledge of what's going on out there, right? What are the attackers thinking? Where are they coming next? How advanced are they? Where are they in cyberspace? And when are they going to come after me? So figuring out the right thing to do can paralyze a lot of folks because they have imperfect knowledge, or they don't have the people on the staff that could think about these problems. And the secondary part of that dilemma, number 1, is how much do I need to do? So you can't defend yourself against everything, and you can't afford to bankrupt your company to keep buying more security things. That's just frankly terrible business. And so you need to have a logical way to identify what's important and how much of it do I need to do. So that's step 1 of the defender's dilemma. Step 2 is, okay, even if I can figure out the right thing to do, how do I do it? What do I buy? How do I install it? How do I train my people? How do I manage this technology? And it has to keep improving over time and maintaining. And so security, as we all know, is not an event. and it's not a product. It's a whole process. It's a whole series of things across a life cycle that I have to keep doing. I don't get to be finished. And so it's like managing safety or a lot of other things. I have to keep on top of things, keep improving, keep maintaining, and I have to measure and so forth. So I have to, part one and part two. What's the right thing to do? Then how much do I need to do? But the thing that has really changed in my perspective from the last several years, and the thing that really changes behavior, is what I call, how do I convince others that I've done the right thing? And this is where we're seeing the shift of cybersecurity from a technology focus to a business management focus. That is, it's not good enough to do the right thing, whatever that is, and it's not good enough to just implement it all. I have to deal with, who are these others I have to convince? Well, I have to convince my boss, number one, so they have a budget, right? So they have time to do these things. But I have to convince auditors. I have to convince regulators. I have to convince lawyers and judges and lots of parties now that I've done the right thing, including the one that's dominating the conversation right now is the supply chain. How do I know that it's okay to bring you into my supply chain? Or how do I convince a big company that I'm a safe partner to bring in? So when I'm focused on number three here, I have these other verbs. I have to assess where I am. I have to compare myself to others. I have to negotiate trust between multiple parties. And, I might have to do it for my enterprise, but typically I have to combine my assessment of multiple enterprises into one place. So I might be trying to understand, is my government improving? Or is the critical sector getting better? Or is my supply chain, I can measure, I might have 100 companies in my supply chain. I have to have some quick and inexpensive way to assess the security. But when I put it all together, what's the risk that I have to face from a business perspective? So this whole defender's dilemma is really a conceptual way to think about all the problems that I have to deal with in terms of cybersecurity, not just as a technology problem, but as a business problem. And how do I bring all this together? So let me go through some of these really quickly. I'm going to focus first on this. What's the right thing to do in terms of technical problems? Well, we have been working on this for several years, and the long-term trend that we're on at the Center for Internet Security is to bring more data and rigor to the way we make control choices and the way we make recommendations to you. So the traditional model is kind of like when I described the CIS controls. How did they originate? Well, I grabbed a bunch of smart people and we went off into a room and we argued until we agreed on a number of things and we wrote them down. And that's useful. These were very smart people. They had a lot of experience, and it was useful at that time to write them down so that we could share them broadly with others. But, if I'd have picked a different set of people, I might have gotten different answers. And by the way, each of them had an unequal amount of experience. They came from different backgrounds and technologies. And so what I really want is a way to formalize this, bring more rigor to it, in particular, base it on data. My background's in mathematics, so I'm always looking for a way to bring data into decision making. And so we built a kind of a structure that we call the community defense model. And it's nothing fancy. It's a way to bring things together so that we can look at the data that's available to us and use it as the basis for security recommendations, and do that in an open and transparent way that we can share with everyone. So this community defense model has three primary elements. One is the data itself. As I mentioned, we're getting attacked every day. And so there's lots of data being collected by lots of vendors and lots of government agencies about these kinds of attacks, mostly to summarize them and to share them with others. The one that really pioneered a lot of the thinking about this is from a company called Verizon. And the DBIR is their Data Breach Investigations Report. And that is a really important thing to read every year because they do such a great job of pulling information together, not only information from their business model of responding to incidents, but they have literally many dozens of partners that contribute data that become part of the analysis. And in fact, the Center for Internet Security is one of the partners. So I mentioned we run a 24/7 ISAC operational mission, and the summary of that kind of information goes to Verizon to incorporate within their report. So we have lots of data, and there are many other sources like that, and many other annual summaries that are produced by vendors. So you have data, but data by itself isn't enough. You need a model or a way to organize that data, ask it questions, structure it, and use it for other purposes. What's emerged in the industry is something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And ATT&CK is an acronym for something I forget right offhand. But it's become the accepted way to express or talk about attacks in a more rigorous way. So I'll go into a little bit more detail in a bit, but think of it this way: as if I looked at an attack, right? I had human beings come in to analyze after the fact an attack and what the attacker did and what they used and how they got it and the steps they took. Think of the ATT&CK framework as a way to describe the very basic elements. You might think of them as the atomic elements of attack. Right? What were the specific pieces of data? What were the tools that were needed and so forth that would allow this attack to happen? And it abstracts that into a model that says this is a way to describe any attack or set of attacks using a rigorous structure called the ATT&CK framework. So we take our sources of data, we use ATT&CK to express it or describe that data, and then the verb I use primarily is translate. So there's a lot of discussion in our industry about sharing information. And believe me, sharing information is important, but people don't put it in the right context typically, right? The goal is not, if we just shared all the information that we all had, well, what would happen is we'd all be overwhelmed. There's too much of it. It's too noisy. It's uncalibrated or not normalized. And so it's collected to different levels of quality and sourcing. The verb that really matters in cybersecurity is not share, it's translate. How do I translate millions of data points of bad things, right, attacks and so forth, into a small number of positive, constructive things that the typical enterprise can do about it? That's why you would read these annual reports, right? You're not trying to build a company of threat reporters, unless that's your business model. You would read these big fancy annual reports because you want to see what applies to you. How do I translate them into action for my company, for my enterprise, for my agency? So translate is the really important verb here. So we have data, sources of data, we have models, and then we have translation. And that's about all you need to know about the community defense model, which is our way of underlying or building rigor under the hood of our recommendations. So let's go through just a couple of details here. What we did, we focused on what we called the most common or most important attack types. So some days it feels like we're being hit by millions of attacks every day, and we are. But it turns out what we're really being hit by are millions of repeats of the same types of attacks over and over and over again. And we've studied these at length, and lots of folks in the industry have. And it turns out that almost everything that happens falls into one of a relatively small number of attack types. And our analysis, and this is pulled right from the Verizon report, that these 5 types of attack account for almost everything that you care about. Things that cause destruction, that cause loss, that enable ransomware. And these are the 5. And in fact, these 5 have been around roughly in this order with minor changes for several years. So we started with the Verizon report, and we work closely with them. We have our own multi-state ISAC report, but we have also gone back to look at the recent issues of a number, and these are just samples. I think we've gone through at least a dozen threat reports lately to try and understand what are the most important attack types that have been identified by these different reports. That is, what are the attacks then that everyone should worry about, whether they have the time or the expertise to read these reports or not? And it turns out there's a lot in common. So that's what we started with, is these attack types. And every one of these is worth reading. But again, you could overwhelm yourself trying to read all these reports. If you wanted to read one report in any given year, I would focus on the Verizon report. It's easy to read. Their data scientists are very good. And there's a bit of humor in the writing also, and I think you would enjoy it. But it's a good way to get an overview of what's happened across the industry in the prior year. So I'm going to go through some of these details. Again, this could be a little grunty here, but please bear with me. I won't. You don't have to agonize over this. All of this is documented in a paper that we've recently released to the public. Again, at no charge to you. A reference is found in the notes for the presentation. But basically, what we have done is we took our traditional controls framework, our recommendations, and cross-mapped them to all the things that are found in attack. What attack does is it looks at when they analyze these different types of attacks, they look at what are called techniques and tactics, right? One is sort of a higher level, and the next is the lower level. And our goal was to put these together, right? To look at these low-level atomic elements of the attacks and look at what are my options in countermeasures to cause some negative effect for the attacker. What could I block? What could I detect? And so forth. And so we create this master mapping. We selected those attack types that I talked about earlier. We constructed what we call patterns. So all that means is we took those high-level types of attacks like ransomware, so forth, and we expressed them or described them using these low-level elements within the MITRE attack framework to create patterns. We map these then back to what we call CIS safeguards. So what are the low-level recommendations in the CIS best practices? And then how do they map across to the different elements of the attacks? What that allows us to do is try to establish the security value of individual recommendations that we make. Right? So the point of these recommendations is to try and is to bring rigor to them and to say, if we recommend something, what value does it give against a very specific element of a class of attack? That's where we're trying to get. And then we're getting pretty close now to where we want to be. That is, it allows us to then to say, we don't just recommend this because it's a good thing to do. We recommend it because it provides a specific type of value against a specific element of a common type of attack. So I hope you're following that. That's all you need to understand about this, right? The idea is that we do this analysis, and this is a translation job, right? Translate from millions of data points of attacks into a small number of positive, constructive things, i.e. recommendations or actions by defenders. So once we figure that out, we use that as a basis to both make sure that the recommendations we're making in the CIS controls have some value, right? Have a specific value. And then we use it to define subsets of the controls. What is a small number of things, even within our control set, can we identify subsets that we think are particularly important, that give you lots of value up front, or that provide a foundation for more complex or more nuanced defensive steps later. And from there, we pulled out something that we call basic cyber hygiene or essential cyber hygiene. And you hear that term a lot in the industry, right? We need better cyber hygiene, we need to patch more and so forth. But it turns out I can't find any definitions of it. And so that's why we created our own because it's nice to say what an example of hygiene is to patch better. But that's a lot different than saying this set of things constitutes the basics of defense, right? The essential things that everyone needs to do. And that's why we built this way to talk about value and provide a really defendable, shareable basis for all this. So we talked about these attack types. Here are just some of the numbers. And again, these numbers are numbers in our business are dangerous, but they're important. So I talked about these types of attacks. We translated them to patterns. We looked at the individual value of individual recommendations in the CIS, or what we call CIS safeguards, against specific techniques used by the attackers. And what you see here in these numbers, and this is all described in detail in the paper that I referenced, that it turns out that if you follow our recommendations, you get a tremendous amount of identifiable value, and you can see the numbers here, against those top 5 patterns of attacks or the top 5 types of attacks. And so this is where we're moving in the right direction now, right? Providing data and a specific statement of security value. And this is all in the name of what are the most important things I should do? What do I need to do as a defender? Not what could I do, not the infinite list of recommendations that I see in giant security catalogs, but what are the things that I need to do to deal with a specific type of attack. And that's where we are. So you can see that, you don't have to analyze this yourself because we've done it for everyone and then made it public to you. But this is we're still not, this is still not perfect, but this is so much better than we've been able to do in the past and so much better than we can find what others have done. So we have put this out in the public to share it with folks like you, because we want you to understand that we don't just make things up. We look at data and we translate it into positive action so that you can have confidence that these are good recommendations. And again, if you don't like the way we've done it, or you have your own data, that's great. We have made public our method for doing this so that you could just do the analysis yourself, should you choose to. And again, this is part of our interaction with the folks at MITRE who are responsible for the attack model also. So I spent a lot of time there, and I hope you don't mind the little bit of technical detail around the right thing to do. But the other two parts I mentioned of the defender's dilemma, how do I actually do it, right? So once I've identified I need to do these things in order to deal with a certain class of attacks or these types of attacks, how am I going to do it? So let's talk a little bit about the second one. How do I actually do this? Well, once you start thinking about all these actions, I have to purchase things, install, etc., then a bunch of questions come up. How do I get started? Most of us, again, are overwhelmed by this problem. And most of us don't get to start from scratch, right? We're not going to throw our IT and our security away and start over. So I want to derive value from what I've already owned and what I already do, my existing management processes. And how do I prioritize action? So I'm not going to solve security in 30 or 60 or 90 days. So I have to develop a roadmap or a plan over time. I have to convince my boss, and I have to take steps early that will pay off later. How do I learn from others? Most of us learn best by learning from someone who's kind of like us, right, in a similar situation. But how can I find them? And who can help me with training? And how do I know how I'm doing? Where am I? How do I measure progress? How much of this can I automate because I don't have enough people to run all this stuff? And how do I know which vendors can help me do these important things that I've identified? And how can I be sure that what they say they can do, they're going to do? So these are the driving questions that you need to think about when you try to get down to the implementation stage of actually putting security in practice. Well, so these are the things that we are doing at the Center for Internet Security to help you with that. So I mentioned this essential cyber hygiene. We call that implementation group 1. This is the get started plan. This is our recommendation is, if you don't know where to begin, start here because you need to do this anyway. You don't need to analyze threats for months to figure this out. You don't need to subscribe to threat feeds. You just need to get to work. These are the basics. These are essential. This is the foundation from which you're going to build the rest of your defense. That's bolstered or established through the community defense model and through lots of analysis. But over the last several years also, we've been collecting use cases of adoption. So, this all started, the whole controls and benchmarks started very informally. What we've done in the last few years is build the machinery to support users, to find them, to track them, to learn from them, to reach out to them and document how are you using this? Are you willing to work with us to write it down so we can share your experience with someone else? That's what we call a use case. We also have an in-house technology we call Workbench. How do I learn from others? Well, I mentioned most of our work is really driven by volunteers. That is, we pull together people, experts from across the industry and government. And by the way, you would love to find these people. You would love to hire these people, but you probably can't afford them and you probably can't find them. We gather them together in a closed social media platform that we call Workbench. And this is the place where discussions happen, where this content gets created. And you can be a part of that. There's no charge to be a part of that community and to participate directly. And so this is another place where you can learn and have others teach you what they've already done. We've also created and not that long ago released what we call the Controls Self-Assessment Tool. So it's an online web form based tool where you can self-report your progress against all of our recommendations, manage that. You can say, I want to say I'm at this level in this recommendation, and you track that over time and compare yourself to others that are like you. And the idea is, if you share just a bit of data with us, then what you get back is not only the ability to manage yourself, but also compare yourself. Now, this is not a full-fledged, management or auditing type tool. There are plenty of those in the commercial marketplace. But for those that don't have tools, this is a great way to get started at no cost and a way to, again, get value both in managing what your security program looks like and how it's progressing, but also compare. We've also produced what we call the Controls Assessment Specification. So unlike lots of others, we have looked at our recommendations and spent a lot of analysis time saying, which of these can be automated? Which of these lend themselves to detection of, for example, system registry settings or other artifacts in the system? Let's pull those out and write what we call a specification that we then work with vendors to implement. And there are several vendors, and you can look this up on our website, that now take our recommendations, which we've translated into a specification, and modify their tools so that you could automatically measure a lot of our recommendations without having to do manual reports and that sort of thing, or send human beings to look at it. Now, lots of recommendations still do require human beings, but again, the goal is to use automation as much as possible to pull data that demonstrates, yes, you have done the thing that was applied in the recommendation. So we call that the controls assessment specification. So there's a whole range of tools and products and things. Again, these are by and large, these are all freely available to the public and allow you to then to not just take our recommendations, but actually implement them, right? That's the goal. The goal is not to have the best list. The goal is to have the most progress, the most improvements in security for enterprises. So but the third part of the defender's dilemma, how do I convince others? And I said this has become a dominating issue because, and it's a good thing, right? Cyber moving from can I buy the right tool or technology to how do I put this in context of risk making for my company or for my agency? And once you put it in the context of making decisions about risk, I now have to compare this to other things. Right? I can't afford to spend an infinite amount of money to improve security and bankrupt myself. And by the way, I have other risks as a decision maker for a company. So how do I compare this to my other business risks like employee safety or a reputation and so forth? So I've got to now have some way to convince people that I'm on track in terms of my security improvement program. So on the left side here, you see these are the natural questions that appear. How do I compare myself? How do I compare to some established requirement or benchmark or standard? And there are plenty of these in the industry. Is my security program reasonable? Now, reasonable, I put in quotes, that has a special meaning in US law. So a number of states now across the US, and there's some of this in the federal government also, they'll say something like this in legislation. If you handle this kind of data and you do business in my state, then you must use reasonable practices or something like that, right? It'll say you must exhibit due care, and these are terms of art in law, or reasonable best practices, and you must be able to demonstrate that you've done that. So what does reasonable mean? Well, it turns out that these laws don't define it. It's sort of left to the reader to figure out or the courts to decide later. And so we've thought a lot about what reasonableness means in terms of our recommendations. You also need to talk about, as you think about convincing others, how do I measure myself? And how do I present that measurement to other people? Again, I might be part of a supply chain. How do I generate data? I talked about this earlier, to demonstrate where I am or to convince you that I'm in compliance with something. And then how do I pull this together in terms of, there's no one security framework that we deal with anymore, right? There's many. And we have done some surveys. Many enterprises have to deal with, 1, 2, 5, or 10 different sort of security frameworks or regulatory requirements or whatever. And you can't afford to do unique work for all of them because you'll bankrupt your company. So therefore, how can I do the right thing in terms of better security, but present the work and relate it to other security frameworks? So these are the questions that you have to deal with when you talk about this step 3 of the defender's dilemma. And here's just some of the things that we have done at CIS to help you with that. So I mentioned the self-assessment tool previously. It's about knowing where you are in your security journey. We have a more complex method for decision making called the CIS risk assessment method, which is aimed squarely at that reasonable question. And it's been the kind of thing that was developed by a mix of technologists and lawyers and has been tried a few times successfully in courts to help make the argument that an enterprise has behaved reasonably. We have a thing we call the controls navigator. And one of our commitments, again, I think this is pretty unique to us, is that we know that many of our adopters have to deal with multiple security frameworks. And they have to go through an exercise to say, well, I'm using the CIS controls, but I want to present my results in the language of ISO or PCI, if you're familiar with those, or some other European standards or whatever. So I don't want to do separate work. So I have to build a map from what I'm doing to all these different frameworks. What we've committed to do at CIS is we will provide the authoritative mapping from our work to basically every other thing that we can find. And if you find something that you need that we haven't done, let us know and we'll figure it out. And so the idea is rather than you have to do it or you pay someone else to do it, it makes much more sense for us to do it. And we will reach out to the other security framework. And if they're cooperative, then we'll cooperate with them. If not, we'll produce our best judgment. We'll put it out to our volunteers. We'll get it vetted in the community. And then we will publish and maintain it and make it available to you at no charge. So that's the way that we're handling this cross mapping. We also have what we call the Navigator tool, which allows you to kind of sort of in a clever way work across multiple these security frameworks and present your work. And then the last thing I mentioned on this, how do I convince others? There's a trend in the US now that a number of states, and we are working with them, are taking that step that I mentioned earlier. They're saying, you know, we will provide some incentive for a business doing business in that state to improve their security and demonstrate reasonableness if they use, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework and or the Center for Internet Security Controls. And we will work with, if the enterprise uses these things and can demonstrate they have behaved responsibly and reasonably, then they get some incentive. And the incentive depends upon the state, but it might be some sort of what's called safe harbor or liability protection against certain kinds of lawsuits or capping of the damages if they have behaved reasonably. So that turns out has been a pretty strong incentive to get businesses to improve their security in a way that gives them some benefit. So that's the alternative to that, is trying to regulate it from the top down with state level governments or federal governments. And frankly, that has not been very popular, as you might imagine, right? So much better to try some sort of incentivized adoption. And so we are working with a significant number of states that are looking at some sort of thing like that. A number of states have already moved down that route. But it's all aimed at this idea of how do I convince others that I've done the right thing in terms of security. Then I'd like to talk about a number of things here, right? So I mentioned the term security frameworks, and there's all kinds of them, from formal to informal to regulatory to local to national to international. But here's what I think every one of them needs to do. And these are things that guide our work at the Center for Internet Security, and we wish others would do too. That is, we want every security framework, every set of recommendations, or the program that you're developing for your own enterprise, we need to base these more on data about the real world. What are bad guys doing, and therefore what do we need to do? In the same way that we think of things like public health, right? We have to understand the hazards that are out there and translate them into action, and not kind of deal with these well-intended but really just infinite lists of good things to do. That's not good enough basis for spending money, for executive decision making about risk and so forth. So real world data is really important. Having a starting point, recognizing that many enterprises are very early in their security journey. They're very immature. They don't have lots of security people. They might never have a security person working on their team. They can't afford expensive tools or high-priced consultants. So every security program needs a well-defined starting point. Every security framework should point to that, should create that, should allow that to happen, and recognize it's better to get people moving in the right direction than, frankly, beating them up because they haven't solved the security problem. We also need to focus wherever possible on things like measurement, on management, on automation. The technology is too complicated for human beings to do all the work of trying to integrate across multiple tools and sensors and put all this together. We need to design that into every security program, to every framework. Another bedrock principle for us is about independently vetted content. For example, I mentioned the CIS benchmarks. Something like that, you do not need to start from scratch. Just take what we've already done and use that as your basis for example, the configurations of desktops or servers in your enterprise. But also always remember, you want to be able to trace back to the source, right? Because since these were independently developed, they've been vetted by a community. Once you start there, there's a certain level of value they already have. And you do not want to be arguing the merits of every step of that with an auditor or an inspector general or a regulator. You want to say, I started from this independently vetted, publicly known, high reputation content, and I made these 5 changes or 10 changes or 20 changes. Those changes, those differences are worth the attention of human beings, right? And special analysis. The 90% that's the same as everybody else, frankly, technology can tell us what that looks like. And we don't need to spend a lot of scarce, expensive human being time to figure that out. We also want all these principles, and this is why we do this at CIS. My belief is that every security framework should be as open, transparent, as freely available as we can make it. Now, we still have to run a business, right, to make all this content available, but the goal is as much freely available transparency, clear explanations in the public of why we recommend, why we do this, etc. I also pointed to the what we call an ecosystem of things to help you achieve the good intentions of the recommendations of any security framework, right? So you should look for this. It's not enough to have a good list of things to do. You want to look at what has built up around that list of things to do. Who are the vendors that support it? What is the training that's available? What other enterprises are already using this and willing to help share their lessons learned? You want to see that that exists and someone is managing that and that's available to help you. And then this whole cross-mapping, this alignment through all other security frameworks, we are committed to make that as easy as we can from the Center for Net Security. And we encourage all other security framework makers to do likewise, right? The goal is that's not a place for competitive advantage or competition. That's just something that everyone has to deal with. And therefore, we ought to make that easy for everyone and as inexpensive as possible. And then this notion of using market forces to preferably encourage better security behavior. For example, the insurance industry has been, struggling with this and starting to mature in terms of the way they encourage better practices to make sure that you're both insurable, but also that for example, they could give you a discount if you show that you're a well-managed, highly secure enterprise. Then you ought to be able to get better rates for insurance, just the way we would when we have a safer car or a safer house or whatever and the market forces are used to encourage or discourage certain types of behavior. And the same applies to government action. Again, the sort of social conditions are no one is excited about sort of top-down government regulation. It's much better that we as an industry figure out the important things to do and find ways to encourage that kind of behavior across the entire enterprise here. So that's my closing thinking about security frameworks and security programs and all that. Let me wrap up to summarize the thinking here. And this was not a commercial for what we do at Center for Internet Security. Again, we give all of our content away for free. I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of translation into action. Right? How do we identify the most important things to be done? How do we get them done? And how do we get them done in a way that's explainable to others, whether it's the legal system or regulators and so forth, or supply chain friends. And we need to think of this problem holistically. So if you were trying to put together a security improvement program for your enterprise, or you're trying to do it across a sector of the economy, or you're trying to do it across a nation, these kinds of conditions and issues all still apply to you. And in fact, if you don't think of them early, then you wind up paying the price at the tail end. And I think that's where a lot of the industry, at least as I see it in the US, is today. We have sort of a chaotic approach to this. Everyone's sort of doing their best. And then we look at the end to see, does it all add to up to something important or good or better? And we have no way to do it because we've all taken a different approach. We've all had a different set of data. We've all interpreted it differently. And so you get kind of chaos at the end. I watched this happen for decades across the U.S. government. I watched it, as in my interaction with industry, and I see a lot of it today. And that's why we are committed to many of the actions that we are doing here at the Center for Internet Security. And again, we give this away. So if you like our approach but don't like our data, fine, take our approach and use your own data, and it's all good. We support that, and we'll cheerfully work with you on that. So this is how to reach us. We are a small company, and I think we're a little over 300 people now. About half of them are working in the operational, helping to secure state and local governments. The other half work in best practices or supporting the company as a whole. But we're very reachable. Any of our products, you can reach the team leader. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn or email or whatever mechanism that you like. But our goal is to, we are part of the community. We have to deal with problems 24/7, just like you do. We are a modern computing enterprise with a complicated business partnerships around the world, just like many of you. And so this is not an abstract problem for us. We are not a think tank writing clever papers and then going on to the next thing. We are everyday participants in the same problems that you face. And so we are here to help make things better for you and for us also. So with that, I really thank you for your time and attention. It's an honor to be here to speak to you today. And I look forward to your questions. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Tony, for such a great presentation. And I would like to also to thank all our audience, and I will address them also in Spanish, because some of them, are from Latin America and Spanish-speaking countries. Bienvenidos y gracias a todos los que están en esta presentación con Tony Sager. Estoy seguro que les resultó muy atractivo todo este material que estuvo compartiendo con nosotros. Esto es lo único que voy a decir en español. Estamos pensando, considerando la posibilidad de traducir esta conferencia y ponerle subtítulos en español. Eso ya lo anunciaremos más adelante cuando la tengamos lista. Mientras tanto, voy a regresar a conversar en inglés con Tony Sager y tenemos ya preguntas de parte de ustedes y los animo a que si no has hecho una pregunta, estamos monitoreando los canales a través de los cuales estamos haciendo esta transmisión para que pongas ahí tus preguntas y que me las haga el equipo de producción llegar aquí. Y vamos a empezar con una pregunta de Hernán Balbastro. And the questions are, Tony Sager, are there some documents about CIS best practices to share with us? And there's another question also from Hernan that says, how can we be sure if we select the best framework for our business?
Yeah, excellent questions. Thank you, David. So first, as to the information that we have available at the Center for Internet Security, it should have been on that last slide. Go to cisecurity.org, and everything is available from there. You'll be looking at best practice information. So any document that I referenced, any study, everything is there for the downloading. You have to provide, I think, an email address and answer a couple of questions, but that's it. And then that will give you access to all the information that I talked about today. If you have any problem finding that, you can reach me on LinkedIn or some other, pretty easy to find for any cyber person, and reach out to me directly, and I'll make sure that you get access to that. And as I said during the remarks, you are you can become a part of our volunteer community. That is, we do not have a large building full of experts off thinking great thoughts and then throwing them out the window for the public. We are a volunteer army that comes together, and we provide the structure, kind of the machinery, the ongoing support and sustainment of those kinds of products. And as I said, there's some amazing people that volunteer their time. It's one of the things that has kept me active in the industry. There's so many amazing people who give generously of their time to contribute this kind of information. So everything should be available there. If you look for it, and if you can't find it, please reach out to me directly.
Very good. From Christian Orduño, we have a question. What is your opinion about cyber resilience as a reference model or framework against cyber attacks?
Sure, yes. I think resilience is a term that's really come into vogue in the last few years, and it's kind of come and gone. And some of it's been formalized, so you can find resilience frameworks. And it is actually a healthy approach. So the notion of resilience, right? Yeah, the problem with many of the older security frameworks is they are static, and think of them as a really big, expensive test. So you have a giant document that defines all these requirements, and the enterprise does its best to meet those requirements and buy tools and do all this work. Auditors come in and they do a snapshot. They take a look at how you're doing right now. But what you create are things that don't have much shelf life, you might say, right? As we all know, the day the auditor leaves, the network has changed. There are new connections, there's new technology, there's new patches, and so there's no static look that has much value beyond a very short period of time. The notion of resilience is to look at this much more dynamically. That is, the enterprise has to run, so it's not it passed the test or it didn't. Is the real question is the enterprise capable of operating even under difficult conditions? Even in the face of active attacks, even in the face of constant change. So in some sense, it's just as important, maybe more important, to build the machinery of managing change as it is to have perfect security on one magic moment in time, which we never have. So resilience really specifically accounts for this dynamic. Now sometimes people say there's a habit in the security business I've watched over decades. Well, the current model isn't working, so let's throw that away and start over with something new. And they come up with a new name, and maybe it's resilience or whatever. But so in the worst case, that's what it's like. It's like we give up on all this managing of our IT. Let's just try something new. But there's a lot of good thinking and healthy information out there about this idea of how do I operate my enterprise in this really dynamic environment. Now, I grew up in a Defense Department organization, so we thought about that all the time. The idea of you don't get to just choose to go offline because things are risky, right? Especially if you're in the business of war, you have to fight under really difficult, degraded conditions. And so resilience is a sort of a natural way to think of it. And I think now that as that thinking comes into the sort of more mainstream commercial marketplace, I think there's a lot of good there. Again, don't fall into the let's throw everything away and start over. But this idea of there's constant change. How do I manage it? How do I sense the change? How do I know what's going on? Decide whether it applies to me and what changes I have to make in my enterprise to deal with this change. And that's what a lot of the controls are about. And that's what I talked about. Again, very few of us have the ability to go out and read all these threat reports and sort of translate them into action. Therefore, I need a high scale way to do that. And since most of it applies to all of us, whether we realize or not, it's better to do that together than individually.
Thank you, Tony. I have this also very interesting question from David Shekaiban. What is your opinion on open source against commercial security tools? Is it enough? Is one better than the other?
Well, that is one of the classic debates of the security business, open source, and I had to deal with us a lot in when I was in government, and it's just hit the news again. Right, the Log4j has really brought some of this back to light. So the promise of open source, and I've been around it, contributed, and been part of that community, is that by making the source open, then it's available for inspection. Right? People can look at it if they don't trust it. They can decide, are there flaws in it? They can they can tailor it for their specific use. The reality is a little messier, that a lot of our open source is very fragile. Very few people have actually looked at it other than the authors. And we've taken code that works and then built really complicated, high-risk operational machinery around it. And so there's just been need, and it's been debated for well over a decade, about going back to identify parts of open source that are really important for the entire community, and how will we bring it the right level of attention and testing and maintenance so that it gets care that is consistent with the importance that it has in the ecosystem. And so I think this is an important moment in our history here, because I think people have started to recognize how critical this is. And therefore, big companies, governments need to put some resources into making sure that these critical parts of our infrastructure that happen to be open source, and much commercial is based on open source also, are in fact inspected, tested, developed better, well-maintained, there's a defined process for managing the inevitable problems that are found and so forth. So it's never going to be one or the other. But I would say as a community at large, we need to do more to improve the security of open source. And that's just been the nature of it, is that there's so many pieces of code out there that are very complex, that are maintained by a very small number of people, and that, frankly, we don't know where they're being used. There's the interconnectedness of everything is so complex now. Again, as we're seeing play out in the press today, that this really deserves some serious attention. From protocols to actual specific implementations, all this deserves another look.
Very good. Tony, what are the challenges of local governments? What challenges are local governments facing in the U.S. and abroad that you are aware of, and how are they addressing the cybersecurity problem?
Yes, it's a wonderful question. I think that they are struggling. So even in the U.S., we sometimes speak separately about the state's problems, and then in parallel we talk about the local and what we call local, tribal, territorial government challenges, and that's where there just aren't enough resources. So we run a large annual survey across the U.S. every year. It's always the top few items are always the same. We don't have enough resources. We can't get the people. And so the nature of state governments is that they are not salary competitive with the IT and technology companies. And so they're always scrambling to have both the people as well as the resources to buy tools or to do complicated security assessments. It just is not there for the vast majority of them. The same is true for small businesses too, right? And I would be surprised if the situation were any different in Mexico or any other country. That just, these are not companies that are going to hire cybersecurity professionals, right? They're going to, and many of them have outsourced their IT management anyway, and they're not. The next person they hire is not going to be, a technology wizard in security. So they are struggling to get ahead of that. Now, as I've mentioned, our nonprofit, the Center for Internet Security, provides a certain level of service across the country to state and local governments. And so some of that we address through centralizing. That is, the federal government has put aside money that is becomes part of our resources to provide those services to state and locals. And I think there are a number of those cases where it really is worth a look at. How do we centralize some more of this, either at the state level? Some states might have the resources, but the local governments, the county governments, the city governments under them do not. We're also looking at how do those small governments get their information technology? As I said, many of them don't run their own information technology. They get it either through a commercial service provider, or that service might be provided by a higher level of the government. For example, the state could provide certain services there. And so we're, if that's the case, it doesn't help a lot to educate the local government, because they can't do anything about it. They have already asked this managed service provider to do this for them. The challenge, and then we start to shift our role from the Center for Internet Security to say, then our job with local governments is not to teach them how to run IT securely. It's to teach them how to contract for IT services securely. So many managed service providers, and many of them are, at least in the US, are very small businesses who don't have a lot of security capability either. So when you ask them, they say, well, we don't provide security separately because no one asks for it. No one will pay for it, right? So you have to work, this is now economics, right? This is not technology. This
right.
is, I have to organize the supply of service providers, but I have to get the buyers to demand it.
Right.
And so you need a consistent way to do that, right? You can't just say, you need to ask for more security in your contract. You have to give them specific language that says, you need to ask your service provider to do these things in this way. And that's where a security framework is important, like the work that we do, because it gives you something specific to ask for. And then, the economics will sort of move it in the right direction, where the service provider says, well, if people are, if they ask for it, I can charge more for it. Therefore, I can hire a security person. I can buy more security tools. And it turns out a lot of the basic things are often built into the tools that people are already using to manage um, um, information technology things, but they're often not turned on because no one asks for it. Or there's, again, the trade-off is the tighter you run security, sometimes applications will break, and so you have to look at that trade-off, right? How do I do this in a way that is easy to manage from the service provider perspective? So what we've been doing at CIS then is looking sort of higher in the food chain here, or further upstream is the right term, at the service providers, and how do they manage better? How do we equip them with information that we help provide? And we're starting to bring together now service providers and say, let's figure out how we can all provide better security in a way that the marketplace can ask for it. Right? So you have to be able to work both of those. The third part of that, David, and I don't know if this applies in your world or not, but you need to, another way you encourage behavior is you find a way to talk about it in legislation or regulation, or through other mechanisms like insurance, right? So the idea is, again, we're moving from how do I solve the technical problem to how do I solve the business problem, right? The business problem is risk, and the risk might come from safety or reputation or technology and many factors. And so the closer that we get to managing cyber risk in the way that business owners manage other risks, the better we're going to be. Right, so we need a way, but the problem is it's a bit of a wild west, right? The technology is confusing, it has different languages. The insurance companies are struggling to figure out, well, what is the equivalent of, building codes? What is the equivalent of an actuarial table, right? And we don't have that kind of concreteness in the data in cybersecurity. We're still learning that. So we need to bring those parties together to say, how do I know that a certain practice, in fact, lowers the risk? And that's another reason why we've put so much energy into this data, right? This is the way we think about risk more broadly in society. We say, what is the risk? Some of the risks we manage by building them into the system so that individuals don't worry about it, right? You have pretty high confidence that if there are building codes, then someone has defined those, someone has tested things like the strength of the materials and the building techniques, and an inspector has looked at them and decided that this particular building meets them or it does not. But you don't ask the buyer to do that, right? The buyer sort of says, okay, has it been signed off by an inspector? Did it meet building codes? That's not a perfect system, right? Because people do make mistakes or they get sloppy, but it's a well understood way to manage risk. And so you have to look at it, not as about, did I buy the best technology, but can I encourage the better technology, again, through government action, through things like insurance, through liability, and can I increase the supply, organize the suppliers, and then increase the demand to make it economically feasible for everyone to do that. So I think this is the future of this. We are not going to, the headlines in the U.S., right? We will never produce enough cybersecurity professionals from the schools, and even if we could, there isn't the money or the economics to hire them. Right? Most of our economy is small businesses who do not, this is not the way they will operate. And so we need to build more of this into the way we decide what to do, the way we contract for IT services, the way we receive things from the vendors. We just have to build vastly more of this into here so that people don't have to become experts to make good decisions. And this is true in every other domain of risk that we think.
Thank you very much for your answer, Tony. We have several questions here, and there's this question that I think it's very brief, but it's also very profound. It's from Ana Lilia, and she asks, what are the key success factors of a cybersecurity program?
Wow. Okay. Okay. I can tell you when I've seen the most success. And when I've seen a lot of success, it often comes down to leadership. Does the business executive, does the government leader see this as important? And it's not that they understand the technology, it's that they appreciate that there is risk here. And so they have to think about that. So they It's not a matter of just writing big checks and throwing money at the problem. It's understanding the risk and seeing it kind of holistically. So the biggest example that I've been a part of was actually done by the U.S. Air Force, and it was very much driven by leadership. But it wasn't driven first as a security activity. It was driven as a budget and management activity. That is, it was a large enterprise. They realized they were buying desktops and servers and technology from dozens of different sources. And they had lost the opportunity for scale, to get better pricing, and they were buying, everybody was buying their own IT and doing it uncontrolled. And what you found was it's cheaper to buy it up front, but it was now costing the enterprise a huge amount of money to manage it, right? Because things were breaking all the time. They were incompatible. They couldn't, different units couldn't talk to each other. And so it was by thinking of this primarily as a management and economic question, then security came along for the ride. And so it wasn't, security by itself is kind of a hard sell for because you spend money and there's no obvious immediate benefit. But security as a part of the management equation, it turns out to be, in the best case, it saves you money.
Right.
Running your desktops in a uniform way saves you a lot of money on the trouble ticketing and incompatibility that happens later, right? And so you can then turn to your software suppliers or the software you write for yourself, and you say, this is what my enterprise looks like. If you want to write software for me, it needs to run here, not on just any random Windows machine, for example. And then you get all these incompatibilities because every programmer thinks that they own the entire system, so they get to use every port and every service, and you create a lot of dangerous things inadvertently, right? Because you just didn't have any control over it. So a longer answer to a profound question, and it really is a difficult question. But the best cases I've seen are this sort of coupling of sort of a leadership seeing the responsibility, but also seeing and understanding risk, but also seeing the economic opportunity to better manage the enterprise, better understand what they have better control of their inventory. It always struck me as kind of odd. My dad was in the U.S. Army, and he was a supply sergeant. And, in physical space, right, executives want to know, what do I have? What state of repair is it in? Are my people trained? They would have very concrete ideas on what constitutes good behavior in physical space. And then in cyberspace, it's all kind of a mystery. It's very complicated, and no one really knows, and we're always patching, things are always changing. And so we sort of put up with these big unknowns when we wouldn't put up with that in physical space. Now, there are different problems, I get it, and IT stuff is definitely more dynamic. And by the way, in physical space, and this is what my dad taught me, even the general who says, are we ready to go fight? He doesn't know exactly the state of every piece of equipment.
Of course.
But he knows it well enough that he can make a reasonable decision that, are we ready to go? And that's where we need to be in cyberspace, right? We'll never get perfection. Perfection is the enemy of the good in cyberspace, because there are always old people like me coming up with 10 more bad things or 5 more reasons why you can't or whatever. And that's not helpful, right? The goal is not to have perfection. The goal is, do I understand, do I have visibility, control, et cetera, of my assets and know things well enough that I can make good, not perfect, but good decisions about the risk, for example, of conducting commerce over the web. So, thank you, but a great question.
And a great answer also, Tony, thank you. I have a couple of questions here that I will try to merge.
Right.
And the reason is they're interesting in their own, but they both address the problem of the small organization, a small and medium enterprise. One question asks, how close are we, maybe in a time frame, how close are we from having services addressed to small and medium enterprises that are effective and at the right cost for an SME? That would be one question. And the other one would be, what are the top 3 qualifications or must have when you're hiring a cybersecurity service provider for a small organization. If you can give us your thoughts on this about
Wow. Okay.
what's your view right now from all the information that you have gathered and all the experts that you talk to?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of quick things. So we have now started to produce over the last year to two specific information at the Center for Net Security to support small businesses. Right. So very readable. If someone, and by the way, many of our works get translated into other languages by volunteers. And if someone wants to do that, we would be happy to then host it, make it available to the public. We'll provide, kind of a quality check on it. But, again, the goal is make these things available as freely as possible. So go check at cisecurity.org to find some of these small business things. We're also working with a number of the big vendors, and like some of our documents for small businesses. Step one is to make best use of what you already own. And so we are now, actually one document's in prep right now, how to develop essential cyber hygiene in a typical Windows environment. So for a lot of our adopters, their desktops are all Windows. It's kind of a very vanilla basic. And the idea is we also work with the vendors to say, can you turn on all the options and sort of create an environment that is consistent with our recommendations so that people don't have to do all this themselves. And so we're both writing documents to help people who want to do that, and then working with the vendors so that things get delivered that way. So we still have some work to do around that, but that's our goal here, is to help people with these simpler to read, very straightforward, make best use of what you already own, I think is a really important part of this. And even if you aren't going to do all the configuring and set up yourself, you have now a template that we could start to use with service providers to say this is the way to configure per the Center for Internet Security's recommendations. I also mentioned the work that we've done with the cloud providers, as many small businesses have chosen to outsource their IT to Amazon Web Services or places like that, or they do it indirectly through a consultant or a service provider. You can now go to Amazon and say, I want all my, if you have a small business with 25 desktops that are Windows 10, I want them all pre-configured to CIS's guidance. And they will do that for you. You have to pay them, for that. But I mean, that's the idea, is to make it as hands-off as we can, build it into the infrastructure, something you ask for in a contract, as opposed to something you build yourself. So we're doing more work around these small business to make our information available for small companies, and then also trying to make it so that they don't have to build it themselves, but they sort of contract for it. They get it through Amazon, Microsoft, Google, etc., and do that automatically. So please. But whoever asked the question, please feel free to go take a look at what we've already done. And remember, we are driven by volunteers. So most of our ideas actually come from the community. If we heard from a number of listeners to this or the companies that you work with, David, that these are some key needs, we are happy to take that on and take a look at it, especially if you have volunteers who want to work on it with us, and then we'll find some way to do that. So that's how we operate. It's a very community-oriented approach to this. So small businesses, that's a big part of it. There was a second part to that about the top 3 qualifications of a service provider. So I hope that from some of my remarks, it's helped someone who's looking for a service provider to ask some of these questions. Okay, and get past the I need 25 desktops with this vertical application to run the sales front end, and these 10 need to be the back end, accounting machines. Asking about some of the things that we provide. And again, this is not a commercial for us, but that is how will the desktops be configured? Can they be configured to the guidance from the Center for Net Security? If I give you these items that come out of the essential cyber hygiene from CIS, will they in fact, will you implement them in the machines that the virtual machines that you provide for me as a service provider? Things like that can be built in to the service. Now, again, we're still trying to match the supply and demand up, right? So some service providers will know exactly what you mean, and they're on it. And quite a few others will go, we never heard of that. What is that? I don't know your environment as well, but you probably have a number of the same kinds of things to deal with, like PCI and other industry level regulations like that that we are embedded in a number of those also. They'll give you a chance to sort of say, well, you need to do this kind of stuff anyway. And so, when you start to outsource and move to a service provider, that doesn't mean you get rid of your responsibility as a business owner, right? You still have to deal with requirements, with regulation, and so forth. But now you've got to find a way to get the service provider to provide you the essential data that said I've met the requirements, for these industry level things or for the government or for liability.
Well, thank you, Tony. And in response to your open invitation for volunteers, what I think that we will do here at the Consejo C, at the Consejo de Seguridad de la Información y Ciberseguridad, I think we are going to just put up try to build a task force and to work with the Center for Internet Security on all these volunteer openings and opportunities that you have. We will be very glad and pleased to work along with such a respected organization, I must say worldwide respected organization.
Thank you so much. So it's a very generous offer, and we appreciate it. Again, we're a relatively small company, but with this big footprint of people who contribute ideas and time and so forth. And again, the goal is to solve your problems, right? How do we help the community get better? And the way we do that is by pulling together, right? To recognize we have all these problems in common. So let's find a way to make those kinds of things happen, Dave. I'd be honored to work with you.
Thank you, Tony. Well, let me, just before closing, thank all our audience for sending their questions, very good questions, that brought out the best answers from Tony. So thank you very much for all your questions. And we are wrapping up now this session, and I would just like to allow Tony for final thoughts. So Tony, what's the last thing that you would like to tell us?
Well, number one, thank you to everyone who made the time to listen, because I know that we're all very busy, and if we're not dealing with Log4j, we're dealing with whatever the crisis of the week is. This business is very hard to keep up with. Right? There's always something bad that's happening, and every week, every month, there's a new thing aside from the business demands. So I really appreciate the time that people have made. And again, this is not a commercial. We're many of us that are doing this work at the center. This is a second career for many of us, and this is about trying to make a difference in how we improve security for everyone. And when we say everyone, we mean everyone. So the time is appreciated. If we can find some things to work on together, that's great. And we are honored to make the time to do that. I was driven by this because, as I said in my remarks, I'm at 45 years now and counting of this, and have seen a lot and watched the struggles, right? How complicated, how messy this business of IT security can be. And it's only gotten dramatically harder over the last several years because we're more interconnected. The criminals are coming for us. I mean, that is, any criminal that is not coming at you through the web is incompetent, right? This is where the money is. This is where the impact is. Of course, they're coming after us. And so this is a matter of economic security for all of us, for social responsibility for all of us. And so we need to do things together to make this a better place for all of us to be part of it. So I'm really honored to be part of the crew here at the Center for Internet Security. I appreciate it, David. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with your audience. I'm pretty reachable if you want to find me through LinkedIn, and I'll share an email address if you reach me there. This is what I'm doing in my second career. I'm happy to share ideas, take great ideas, see if we can build projects around them. So I appreciate all the time that people have invested here today, and look forward to more. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. It was an honor having you here, and let's keep in touch.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone that was following this talk. We'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.
Tenemos más contenido como este para ti, pero antes te invitamos a inscribirte a nuestro canal y activar las notificaciones. Si te ha gustado este video, no olvides darle like y compartirlo con otras personas. También puedes guardarlo para el futuro o dejarnos un comentario, nos dará gusto leerte. El Consejo Sí es una asociación civil enfocada en elevar la seguridad de la información y ciberseguridad en la escala nacional. Conoce más de nosotros y de lo que podemos ofrecerte visitando el sitio web consejosí.org.